Hi there, my name is Neil Blevins, and this lesson is called Fighting Mech Analysis, the Importance of a Visual Hook. So as a designer, it's important to use visual hooks, which are a set of rules that define a unique look, a look that makes your design stand out from the rest of the crowd. For a junior designer, this might be applied to a single design, or as a more senior designer, a visual hook may be something that needs to be applied to an entire alien race, or even an entire IP or franchise. So this lesson will illustrate what a visual hook is, and how important it is, and to prove the point, I'll be analyzing the visual hooks from 19 of my favorite fighting mech franchises. So, examples of visual hooks. Let's start simple, visual hook for a single design. So let's say you're making a character, and that character has a ridiculously huge sword. That can be the visual hook for that character. So if someone says, what does that character look like? The other person would say, oh, he's the guy with the giant sword. And now you know you've done your job as a designer, because the audience can easily identify that character from the other characters in a single sentence. And hopefully that visual hook can also say something about the role or personality of that character, but that's a topic for a different time. If working on an environment, a visual hook can be an architecture theme. For example, all the pieces of a building have triangular shapes. Or the visual hook could be a material, like everything is made out of white marble or black marble accents. Think of Star Wars. Tatooine's main visual hook is that it's a desert planet, and Hoth's main visual hook is it's a snow planet. Now let's get a little bit more complex and define an entire group or alien species with a visual hook. The simplest is something like all the bad guys wear black, or all the bad guys shoot red lasers. In the video game Destiny, there are a number of alien species you deal with: the Cabal, the Fallen, the Hive, and the Vex. And each of these species have their own set of visual hooks that make them easy to tell one from the other. So the Cabal are like rhinos. Everything is fat and bulky. And the Fallen are skinny and frequently have 4 arms. The Hive are white and are kind of these skeleton zombie creatures. And the Vex are covered with golden metallic armor. They usually have a single glowing eye and have big fan heads. So even though each alien race may have 5 or 6 different types of combatants, each with their own flavor, you can always tell any member of, say, the Vex because they all share the same visual hook. A visual hook can also happen at the IP level. While different races and planets in Star Wars have distinct looks, all the stuff in Star Wars have some common visual hooks. Like all the spacecraft show wear and damage and follow a similar philosophy of paneling and greebling. And all lasers coming from weapons have a similar look. In the case of Star Wars, there's even audio hooks, like all the lasers have a similar sound when firing. And that sound really helps define Star Wars from other space operas. So visual hooks can happen at many different levels, and are used to make an individual, group, or universe unique. So let's go to the giant mechs, and the meat of our discussion. We've had giant fighting mech IPs around for about 50 years, appearing on TV, films, video games, books, and comics. Stuff like Battletech, Macross, Gundam, and Mazinger. Most of these IPs have distinctive visual hooks to help them stand out from the other similar franchises. So I'm going to go through a number of examples, pointing out their visual hooks, and in doing so, it might inspire you when it comes time to give your own project a distinct visual hook. So let's start with the Transformers. The first series of Transformers toys borrowed heavily from pre-existing toy lines from Japan, so it wasn't really until the second series that the unified Transformer visual hooks became common. But there are a number of attributes that most of the Transformers shared. First, they tend to have strong saturated colors. They tend to have very square, blocky arms and legs. They have similar eyes, either 2 glowing human-shaped eyes, or else a single lens, like a pair of sunglasses. They either have lips, or else a mask that hides their lips. And of course, a big visual hook, as well as a thematic hook, is that they all transform into things, mostly vehicles. And so in robot form, they have elements of their vehicles attached, such as tires or wings. So the GoBots came out slightly before the Transformers, and the two franchises have many similarities, but a few differences. So one of their biggest design differences was their simplicity. Many of their arms don't bend at the elbow in their toy form, and instead of 10 or more steps to transform them, they would transform in 2 to 3 steps. And then most of them are also smaller than their Transformer cousins. So when Michael Bay did his version of the Transformers, many of the visual rules that defined the Transformers toys, comics, and TV shows were basically thrown out the window. So the number one big difference was silhouette complexity. While the original Transformers were boxy and had some simple shapes, the Bayformers were hyper-complex, so no more boxes, just tons and tons of smaller details everywhere. And regardless of how you feel about these designs, you have to admit that they are a pretty unique look, and it's pretty easy to recognize a Bayformer as opposed to a regular Transformer. So Neon Genesis Evangelion. For the Evangelion robots, this was a tremendous popular anime in the 90s. There's a very different aesthetic going on here. So the main visual hook is they're all very tall and thin, almost anemic. They also tend to have hunched backs, and many have items on their shoulders that make their shoulders taller than their heads. They also have very bright saturated colors, much like the Transformers. And bad guy robots in the series, the Angels, have far more variety in shape, although even they do tend to have a giant red orb somewhere on their body as a way to define them as a group. So the 5-star stories. These mechs were designed by Mamoru Nagano and have a very distinctive visual style. So in general, his mechs seem like a cross between a knight and a ballet dancer. They tend to have very, very thick shoulders, and their waists are ridiculously skinny. The symbols and logo design feel very medieval. They also have helmets with visors, and they carry long swords or lances, and many of them have shields. So Maschinenkrieger, these mechs were designed by Japanese artist and sculptor Kao Yokoyama, and these mechs have a very distinct World War II tank feel to them. Their colors are all pretty muted, either green camo, whitish gray, or sand-colored, and their cockpits have this big bubble feel to them, frequently without any eye holes, and this makes the mechs look very top-heavy, like they might fall over. So Mazinger and Grendizer. So the good guy mechs of Go-Naji all have much in common. So first, they tend to have similar color schemes, black, red, and blue, and white and yellow accents. Their colors are bright and saturated. Their arms and legs are simple cylinders, and they all have horns. And the bad guys also share a lot of common DNA. They also have similar cylindrical arms. They all tend to look like recognizable beasts. They also have faces that frequently look like tribal animal masks from Japan or Africa. And in Grendizer, all the bad guy robots transform into a flying saucer, so they all have some sort of saucer element to them. So Pacific Rim. A more recent mech franchise, which owes a lot to the mechs that came before, and I almost didn't include this franchise as its visual hooks are more subtle, but there's a story reason for that, and as you know, story should always trump design. So these mechs have a variety of visual hooks unique to each mech. For example, Cherno Alpha has a giant reactor for a head, Crimson Typhoon has 3 arms and is bright red, and Gypsy Danger is the most humanoid of the bunch. But since in the story each mech was created by a different country, having variety in each mech and not making them all look too similar is a story point. But even with all that variety, there are still a few things that define the Pacific Rim look. First, the details. They all have similar look to the paneling and drips and wear. They're pretty much all bright saturated colors. And they also contain multiple pilots in a control room, and those control rooms look pretty similar. So the insides of the mech are actually the more consistent visual hook. So this is real steel, and these mechs again have unique looks to each combatant, but they also do share some common DNA. They're also all loosely based on the toy from the 60s called Rock'em Sock'em Robots. So they all have quite round arms and legs. They're all pretty humanoid in shape. And the most important visual hook is that since they're all boxers, they all have these big robotic equivalents of boxing gloves. So the first Battletech mechs were actually taken from a number of existing Japanese mechs, such as Macross. But later, Battletech games came into their own design-wise. So the Battletech mechs tend to be more square and blocky in shape. They tend to also have a giant weapon that either replaces their arms or are mounted near their arms or shoulders. Many of them have prominent cockpits, like they're giant vehicles almost more than mechs. And many, but not all of them, have digigrade legs, so they kind of look like a giant chicken. So the mechs of Makoto Kobayashi, when he isn't contributing to works such as Gundam or Battleship Yamato, all have many similar attributes. So the overall shape of the mechs tend to have this slightly melted feel. They aren't exactly square, but they're not exactly round. They kind of feel a little like medieval cast iron pots. There's exposed piping, which is a common theme, especially in the joint areas. And they also tend to have very tiny heads compared to the rest of their bodies. So the Giant Killer Robots, this is an IP from Weta Workshop for a tabletop game. And first they have strong primary colors. The mechs all tend to have limbs that are these flat rectangles. The arms and legs have flat panels that have some sort of logo or visual pattern on them. And the heads all tend to be very Inhuman-like. So the Zoids is a 1980s IP, which is actually seeing a bit of resurgence these days. So the first obvious visual hook is that all the mechs are based on dinosaurs. Second, they look like dinosaur bones with armor plates on them as opposed to the original bodies. Third, they all have similar colors, especially with a strong use of chrome. And then lastly, they all have these little cylindrical plugs on all their joints. So Warhammer 40k. The Warhammer Space IP has been around for years, and while there's a larger focus on the Space Marines, there also are some mechs in there. So most of the mechs have exposed rivets, like you're attaching giant sheets of metal together in the fastest way possible. They look a little like medieval armor. They tend to have eagle crests and similar insignias on them, and they tend to have a hunched back, where the head isn't the highest part of the body. So Iron Harvest is a diesel punk video game, and these robots all tend to have skinny legs and arms and fat bodies. They're made up of metal that wouldn't be out of place in an old steam locomotive, including the exposed rivets. Lots of exposed piping and greebles that wouldn't be out of place in an old boiler room. And lots of rust and patina. So Big O is another Japanese anime. This time it's a more recent one. And the robot arms tend to be these big cylinders that are attached to the body at the midpoint, instead of trying to replicate a human arm where the upper arm is attached to the top part of the lower arm. And then they also tend to have a number of similar details, such as segmented bellies, similar style feet, similar sized upper legs, and oversized hands. So Horizon Zero Dawn isn't exactly a mech IP, but it does have a lot of robots, and they do have a very distinctive look. So first, they're based on animals or dinosaurs. Next, they're heavily segmented with lots and lots of visual detail. But unlike the Bayformers, the visual detail tends to remain inside a simpler silhouette, rather than breaking the silhouette. Their materials are a combination of metal and other futuristic materials like carbon fiber, and they all have glowing elements inside the robot bodies. And finally, Zone of the Enders, which is another Japanese mech IP that has appeared in TV shows and video games. And I'm not as familiar with this property, but I have seen it around a lot, so I'm including it in this list. So first, the mechs tend to wear motorcycle-type helmets. They tend not to have feet, but their legs end in these sharp shapes, and I believe this is due to the fact that they're in space, and there's no need for feet when there's nothing to stand on. They tend to have wings, and the wings are frequently made up of multiple floating segments, and they have long protruding appendages from their lower belly. So now we've looked at many mech IPs and seen the various details and hooks they use to be recognizable. Any mech has certain things in common, but beyond that, they all need to have elements that make them stand apart. So the next time you design a mech, before you even put that first mark on the paper, what will be your mech's visual hook? Will it be a shape, a historical period, a pattern, perhaps a certain type of weapon? Or maybe draw a bunch of really rough mechs and see if any major element speaks to you, and if it does, start basing a whole mech army using variations of that element. And of course, as shown earlier, this type of thinking doesn't only apply to mechs, but any sort of design. Having a strong visual hook is the thing that will bring attention to your idea and make it stand above the rest. So next time you're designing a character or an environment or a whole IP, keep its visual hook in mind, and the whole thing will be much stronger for it. So thank you very much. I hope you found this interesting. Feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want to be notified the next time I post a new video. And check out neilblevins.com in the art lesson section if you want to see more written tutorials and video tutorials like this one. Thank you very much.